Hello, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Robin Gavon, Senior Critic at Large for the Washington Post. And it is my pleasure to kick off Black History Month with our series on Black women in American history. And we begin with a conversation about Ida B. Wells. And we're joined by Michelle Duster, who's written extensively about her great-grandmother. Thanks for joining us, Michelle.
Oh, thanks for having me so much, Robin.
I wanted to just remind our audience that you can participate in the conversation if you can tweet your questions and comments to the handle PostLive. We will hopefully get to some of those questions. Michelle, I wanted to start with a quote from your great-grandmother. "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them." It seems like such a simple statement, but it really resonates today, I think, when the question of truth and turning the light on truth have become really contentious issues. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about what drove your great-grandmother's sense of social justice.
Well, what drove my great-grandmother's sense of social justice was the time that she was living in. Unfortunately, during her time, there was an extraordinary amount of violence against the African American community, including lynching, which is what she became really famous for writing about. And she unfortunately lost 3 of her friends to lynching. She was the first-hand witness to several race riots that happened. And so this was the time that she was living in. And there were false narratives that were pervasive during her time, which basically blamed the victims for this type of violence.
Early on, there was an incident, I believe in 1884, and she was riding a train in Memphis when a white conductor questioned her right to be seated where she was. And she had purchased a first-class ticket. And there was really quite a major altercation before she was thrown off the train. How did she respond to that indignity?
Well, we have to remember that this idea of separate but equal when it came to public transportation was sort of a new concept. My great-grandmother had been riding that train for a while with no problems. And then all of a sudden there were these laws put in place that were segregating things, and she decided to defy that law. And as a result of her being thrown off that train after she actually bought the ticket and ridden the same train she had ridden so many times before, she decided to sue the railroad on the basis of separate and unequal, when the law said it was supposed to be separate and equal.
I mean, as you learned about your great-grandmother's history and her decisions, I mean, were you surprised that that she had such faith in the system, that she, decided to sue, that she turned to the practice of journalism, that she really worked to bend the system to her will and to her needs.
Well, she turned to journalism to chronicle what her experience was with the railroad. That was one of the first things that she wrote about. She was in her early 20s when this happened and just starting in her career. She had been writing for church newsletters, and so somebody encouraged her to write about her situation with the train system. She initially won the lawsuit against the Chesapeake, Ohio, and Southwestern Railroad, but then unfortunately it was overturned a couple of years later when it went all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court. And so that is what sort of changed her idea when it came to the ability for African Americans to get justice, because originally she did get justice, but then, it was overturned. And so she turned to journalism as a way to tell her story and to help people understand the level of indignation, the level of degradation that was happening, and the lack of law when it came to African Americans having their rights respected.
I mean, she has over time become so known for her investigations into lynchings. And in 2020, she was posthumously awarded a Pulitzer. And the citation was courageous reporting on the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during the era of lynching. She came to her investigations, though, if I understand correctly, because of somewhat very personal reasons, because of what had happened to friends of hers. Can you tell our viewers that story?
Right. Well, one of the things that I did include in my book, Ida Be the Queen, and when I was doing research for it, I really did look at what happened regarding her friends, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and William Stewart, who were owners of a grocery store, upstanding citizens, leaders in the community. And basically, they were lynched for being successful. Business people. And when my great grandmother realized that, well, she found out about the lynching because she was out of town when it happened. She realized that her friends were not guilty of the crime that was the pervasive narrative at that time, which was African American men were assaulting and violating white women. And she knew they were not guilty of that at all. So it spurred her to find out how many other people who were innocent of any crime were being lynched. And she found out as she investigated that, or she came to the conclusion that lynching was being used as a form of domestic terrorism in order to terrorize the African American community and sort of keep, African Americans in a certain status sociologically or within our society.
As you looked back on her work, I mean, how often or how did you, I guess, make sense of so many of the reasons why people were lynched, and thinking about the ways in which there's still, to some degree, elements of oppression, jealousy that continued long after your great grandmother's day. I mean, did you find parallels to modern society?
Yes, unfortunately, I do feel that there are quite a few parallels. I mean, my great grandmother grew up during Reconstruction, which was a period right after the Civil War for only 12 years, unfortunately, from 1865 to 1877. But it was a period of time when there was a lot of progress, where newly freed African Americans had the right to go to school, they had the right to start businesses and own land. Men were able to vote starting in 1870. And so she grew up during a period of time when there was an enormous amount of progress from being property to actually having self-determination. And she grew up in a family. Her father was very politically active. Education was very strongly encouraged. And so she had the opportunity to become formally educated. And then there was this backlash that happened. And I think the same thing has happened during my lifetime.
I mean, it often seems like the period of Reconstruction really gets glossed over, gets lost in the conversation about Black history. I mean, have you found, and as you've talked about your great grandmother's life, I mean, do people really understand what Reconstruction was and the impact it had on the lives of Black Americans?
What I have found when I've talked about my great grandmother's life is that most people, well, in this country, we tend to think of the civil rights movement as the 1960s. And so we have this idea that there was slavery ended, and then there was Martin Luther King. So basically, 100 years of history have been glossed over, and so it's not just Reconstruction; it's Reconstruction, and then what happened around World War I. I mean, there was a lot of resistance that happened, in between 1865 and 1955. And then there was also a lot of resistance that happened before 1865. So I think that, unfortunately, we focus on what happened from 1950 until now. And everything that happened before that is sort of, glossed over.
One of the stories that you've talked about that your great grandmother was involved with is the events in Elaine, Arkansas, and the role that she played in in wrongfully incarcerated men. Can you please share a bit of that story?
Right. Well, in Elaine, Arkansas, there was an effort to create a union for sharecroppers who they realized that they were being cheated, out of their rightful amount of money they should have been paid for their cotton, and they decided. And these are World War I veterans, and that's very significant. The role that Black veterans, have played in our country, and they you have to think about, they went and fought for freedom, democracy in another country, and then they come back to their own country and suffer these indignities. And so they were in the process of organizing a union, and were attacked, and they defended themselves, and then they were the ones that were considered the aggressors. And the entire Elaine, Arkansas, the community was greatly impacted. I mean, there was a mass murders that happened, and 12 of the men who defended themselves were charged with crimes, and they were put on death row, actually. And my great grandmother went to Elaine, Arkansas. She went to visit them in the prison, and wrote a whole pamphlet about what happened regarding that riot. And ultimately, they were, with the help of the NAACP as well, they were released.
I mean, I'm so struck by the vast reach of your great grandmother's influence and ambition when it came to social justice. I mean, was there a point at which you have been surprised at the degree to which she was able to sort of see all of these interlinking aspects of injustice? I mean, she was really quite at the beginning of this idea of intersectionality, where she saw the link between sexism and racism and oppression writ large.
Well, one of the things I tried to do in Ida B. the Queen was to help the reader understand all of the different issues that my great grandmother and all of her contemporaries were facing. I mean, she grew up. Her lifespan is from the Civil War to the Great Depression. And so that 68-year period of her life, there was an enormous amount of obstacles that African Americans had to overcome, as well as women, because we have to remember women did not have the right to vote until 1913. So my great grandmother was in her 50s when she finally had that right. So she spent most of her life without having, political engagement as far as from the ability to vote. And so women, during her time, Black women were organizing through women's club movements, and that was a way to sort of have self-determination and empowerment as well. And so there were so many things to battle that she obviously just took on everything that she could.
I mean, you mentioned the right to vote, and I love the story of her when she is working with the suffrage movement, and she essentially highlights the racism within the women's movement and her unwillingness to march in the back of the parade. I mean, I think that's such a powerful moment, and it also certainly speaks to some of the things that we still struggle with today. Um, can you talk a little bit about that particular incident? I hope you know the one that I mean, where she joins the marchers from Illinois and joins at the front of the line.
Right. Well, during the suffrage movement, when women were fighting for the right to vote, there was some racial tension where some white women, did not welcome Black women into their suffrage organizations. And so my great grandmother started her own, the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago for Black women. Now, she had already been involved with several suffrage organizations that were predominantly white, but she made the decision to start something that was only for Black women in order to encourage Black women to have political empowerment on a local level. And I wrote about this in Ida B. the Queen, and I also wrote a children's book, a children's picture book, Ida B. Wells' Voice of Truth, so a younger generation, the little kids can learn about this progression that women have had in our country, and all of the challenges that we have overcome as African Americans and as women.
I just want to pause for a moment and remind our audience that you can submit questions and comments via Twitter. Just tweet them to Post Live. And carrying on with that, I mean, when you were researching and writing about your great grandmother, one of the things that I found amazing is, as you had mentioned earlier, the backlash to her work. The writing about lynching, doing her investigative reporting, and at one point, her offices are destroyed. I mean, how did she carry on with her work, and how did she end up in Chicago?
Right. Well, after her three friends were killed for basically being successful while Black, she decided. What she was wrote about. She encouraged people in Memphis to help make the white community feel something, and so she encouraged boycotts of the streetcars, boycott of white-owned businesses, and she encouraged those who could leave Memphis to just leave, to go to another place where there could be justice, because she felt strongly that there was no way you could get justice in a place where the people who are murdering you are the law. They're the judges, the sheriff, and attorneys and everybody else who is supposed to be protecting you. And so because of what she was writing and encouraging people, and there was a mass exodus from Memphis as a result of her, and I guess other people just feeling like, yeah, we need to go. She was visited and warned to stop what she was doing or else. So she knew her life was in danger, but she just continued writing. And ultimately, she wrote an article that really condemned the white community for being complicit in this, and also implying that some uh, liaisons between Black men and white women were consensual. And that was such a volatile thing for her to say, that her printing press was destroyed and her life was threatened, and she never went back to Memphis again.
I mean, some people have called her fearless, but you make a point of saying that, in fact, she did feel fear, but that she simply moved forward with it. I mean, can how do you sort of respond and process that ability of this woman who, was barely 5 feet tall, to know that, her life had been threatened, and yet she kept moving forward with her work?
I really, when I've tried to sort of get into her head, which is impossible, but I've tried to kind of figure out what drove her. And for me, one of the things that I wanted to do in the books that I've written is to humanize her. For me, it was important to kind of relate to her as a human being, and not the superhero who has no fear, who never doubts herself. That's just not realistic to me. And so I always sought ways to figure out, like, how did she keep moving forward in the midst of fear, despite the fear, despite feeling doubt about herself, or feeling alone sometimes. She faced an enormous amount of criticism, and she was marginalized. I mean, so her life was not easy. And so the way I processed it in my own mind is that she was so focused on getting justice and making sure that the situation that led to her friend's death would be known. And she believed that the truth would lead to justice. If only people knew what was really happening, then there would be some pressure on the Southern community to stop this lawlessness. And so, with her quote, "The way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them," is exactly what she thought. And she continued on, not only writing, but she did a lot of public speaking, not only in this country, but she went to England as well. So she truly believed that the truth would lead to justice.
I mean, that's a great segue to one of the audience questions, and it is from TJ Bird Matarazzo. I hope I pronounced that correctly, from Vermont. I teach high school journalism, and I included exploring Ida B. Wells's writing as part of my unit on the historical development of journalism. I'm curious as to whether you've been able to track Wells's inclusion into curricula, how accepted she is in the canon of studies in American literature, history, journalism, etc., and how that may have changed in recent years.
Well, I have not necessarily been able to track curriculum around the country, but I did edit two books of her writing. One was Ida B. Wells. Oh my God, Ida in her own words, and which has her writings from the World's Fair in 1893, and Ida from Abroad has her writings from England. And the reason I edited those two books was to make her work acceptable and accessible to students. And so that was my hope, that it would be incorporated into curriculum.
I mean, just in the last few years, there have been, monuments and exhibitions devoted to her story. I mean, are you finding that the stories of Black women and their impact on history, are we getting better at telling their stories, or are we still missing the contributions of countless women?
Well, I've been involved in having a monument created in honor of my great grandmother in Chicago, the Ida B. Wells National Monument by Richard Hunt in Bronzeville. And then the street naming Ida B. Wells Drive in Chicago, which I was involved in making happen. Um, and then there's historical markers, honorary street names in Chicago. I've been involved in a lot of different projects, including most recently a suffrage mural that incorporates 10 different Chicago area suffragists, and my great grandmother being one of them. And so in these projects, there has been enthusiasm, there has been buy-in from community and other stakeholders. But actually, I have run into resistance. So everybody is not on board with celebrating Black women's contributions to this country. And considering that only 7% of all public artwork or tributes to women, period, is in this country, and then you break it down by race, then we're still greatly underrepresented. In Chicago, we only have two public artwork in tribute to Black women, which is Gwendolyn Brooks and Ida B. Wells, and that's in the last since 2018. So we have a long way to go when it comes to true representation that's in proportion to our population.
I mean, I'm curious to know how you are feeling about the growing discomfort that so many people seem to have in grappling with some of our history, particularly as it pertains to race.
Well, some people seem to feel that if anybody is recognized for their contributions, then that means they are being erased. And so there's not this idea that there's enough space for everybody. It's like, so there's that fear, I guess, of the great replacement or something, which I think is unfortunate because all of us are part of this country and we have all contributed in our own ways, and all of those contributions need to be recognized. So it's not a matter of if Black women get recognition, then other people are erased. It's we're all included, and we do need to get to a better place where people can see that they are not being erased. There's just addition.
How have you been able to or try to process the backlash that has been bubbling up simply when President Biden announces that he plans to nominate a Black woman to the Supreme Court? Again, that seems like a great disconnect between history and sort of writing gaps in our progress.
Right. Well, the fact that we've had 115 Supreme Court justices and 108 of them have been white men. And I guess people who are having an issue with the idea of a Black woman being considered don't want to think about those 108 white men being the result of affirmative action for white men. I guess in their mind, it's just normal. But if a Black woman is considered, then that's affirmative action. So, it's just kind of an interesting way of thinking about the world, that it's okay for white men to get, almost 90% of the opportunities. But if anybody else is considered, then it's set aside program or some kind of special, being treated in a special way versus them actually being qualified just the same way that the white men were.
I mean, if there's any lesson, well, there are a multitude of lessons, I'm sure, but if there is a single lesson you could distill down that you hope people take from the work and the actions of your great grandmother, what might that be?
I mean, to speak up. You know, that's to me her biggest legacy, is that where she saw injustice and inequality, that she decided to not be silent about it. She happened to be a journalist, which gave her a platform that might be broader than some other people's platforms, but we all have the ability to speak up in our own ways, and we all have the ability to organize. And that was one of the things she did as well. I mean, she was the co-founder of the NAACP and the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. She was involved in, you know, she founded the Alpha Suffrage Club. She founded the Negro Fellowship League here in Chicago. So in addition to her individual work, she was very collaborative as well. And we all can do that.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there on that inspiring note. We are out of time, but I would very much like to thank my guest, Michelle Duster, for being with me today. And I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and please head to WashingtonPostLive.com to register for upcoming events about the role of Black women in American history. This month, we will have conversations about Mamie Till Mobley, the mother of Emmett Till, as well as Judge Constance Baker Motley, the first Black woman appointed to the federal judiciary. I'm Robin Givon for Washington Post Live. Thank you so much.